He has wiped out by his grace through faith in Christ your every sin, past, present, future.
Christian hedonist is somebody who says that my greatest joy, my greatest good is God. And therefore, I will pursue that joy and I will pursue that God above all else. So God's glorified and I'm satisfied.
You are now listening to the Pastor Discussions Podcast.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 94 of the Pastor Discussions Podcast. I'm John.
I'm Joe, and this is your starting again another weekly conversation on doctrine, faith, and the Christian life.
I guess we'll call it season 2.
You can't have 93 episodes in one season.
Wait, what's the typical number of episodes in a season?
Like a TV show?
Well, no, like a podcast. We're breaking new ground here, man.
It depends. So you can't, but sorry, one season is not 2 years, and then we take a season.
Yeah, that's true.
That's
all right. So this would be like season 4. We just haven't been counting for the first 3 seasons. Anyway, we're back. I have got something in my. That's
because you're drinking Mountain Dew.
Yeah, that's probably what it is. So the hiatus ended up being a little bit longer than we anticipated.
So we've been intending to record for at least 2 weeks now.
At least. And then we had a computer failure and we had a
funeral.
A member of our congregation pass away. And so here we are.
Back.
We are back. And we will be regularly recording now. We're back in the rhythm, back in the saddle. I'm getting...
How many more of those you have?
I don't know. That's it. That's all I've got. Oh, man. So you kind of had an idea for our show today. Why don't you lead into that with that? Okay, let me. So we're out of practice.
I was waiting for you to go through we're part of the bar.
Yeah. Okay. We're out of practice. So we are part of the Bar Podcast Network.
Now I feel better.
Yeah. You can find out about them and get great biblical content for your ear holes at thebarpodcast.com. And a very sad announcement to make. After talking with Dave in Chicago of Resurrection Coffee Co., he is no longer able to offer Resurrection Coffee Co. coffee for people outside of Chicago. So he's consolidating his business venture into the cart. Like he's got a cart that he rides around and makes coffee for people in Chicago. So I guess our intro has to change.
Yeah.
And we're going to tell you to fly to Chicago to get Resurrection Coffee Co. coffee. Seriously though, if you know of a good, a good coffee recommendation, because now I'm on my last bag. It's now liquid gold. I have one bag left of Resurrection Coffee Co. coffee. And so if you know of a good replacement, or you can never replace it. That is really seriously, that's been my go-to.
One of the better coffees I've had.
Yeah. So if you have a good recommendation for a coffee.
And don't say Starbucks.
Don't say Starbucks. Please don't say Starbucks. I can just take a blowtorch to some beans and burn them. And then
the thing about Starbucks, though, is once you get used to it, then everything else seems not so good.
Yeah.
It's weak.
Yeah.
It's because you're used to.
Because you're used to a fire in your mouth. So if you have good coffee recommendations, I would love to hear them and try them out because I'm now in search of a new go-to. So Dave successfully made me a coffee junkie. Snob. Yeah. One more thing for
everything that John likes, he's a snob about.
If I get into something,
guns, beer, now coffee, books.
Yeah, I know. It's a vice. It's a shortcoming of mine. So anyway, all right, with that.
So now we can go.
Now we can, we're now free to move on.
We have to waste 5 minutes. So.
Sorry.
Okay, so I think you ended the year with a sermon kind of on keeping your eyes fixed on the prize.
Mm-hmm.
You were in Philippians. And so I just thought that would be a good thing to talk about, especially, I mean, I know we're a month into the new year now. This was supposed to be recorded 3 weeks ago. But I thought that would be a good jumping point as we get back into the normal rhythm. And this is kind of a time where, I mean, the end of the year is where people take a break and holidays come about and schedules get crazy and you kind of get out of routine and out of rhythm. And so as people are back into rhythm now, I thought that would be a good place to start after our break.
Yeah.
Off. So maybe just let's start with just want to kind of recap the thoughts on why you preached that text. I mean, because we were in topical text mode for Christmas. Just finishing up Romans 12 and had a couple sermons there. So let's start with your thoughts, and then we'll just see what happens from there, like normal.
Yeah. It's what we do. So the reason that I preached from Philippians, where Paul says, forgetting what lies behind, I press forward toward the goal, to the upward call of Christ. And so New Year's is kind of like this natural point in our cycle that we are used to, where we tend to reflect back and make New Year's resolutions. And that's like a big thing. What is going on with my chest is like weirdly congested as soon as we started recording. Anyway, so I started thinking about that, and I think that there's a tendency sometimes among Christians in particular, but I think this is also for everybody, to live in the past, dwell in the past, our past failures, our past shortcomings, our past sins define us. And I think that Satan uses that to discourage us and to keep us from moving forward in our Christian lives. And so what ends up happening is this cycle where we come to a new year, we're like, oh man, I failed at this, I failed at this, I failed at this, and I'm going to do better this year. And then we're 3 weeks into the new year, and I would be willing to bet that statistically, most people have fallen off the bandwagon of whatever their resolution is, if they have resolutions. And then that leads to discouragement and, well, oh man, I couldn't even do this, and and so on and so forth. It's sort of this perpetuating cycle. And in addition, I think there are some people that they're paralyzed by the past. They're incapable of moving forward because they live their lives based on the past, whether that's a past hurt or a past failure or a past experience that's been traumatic for them, or all sorts of different things like that. And it just sort of occurred to me that the Bible really has a forward focus to it. When Paul talks to for example, the Corinthians, he points out their failings, but he doesn't dwell on them. He uses those as an avenue to get to Christ and the gospel, and to call them forward and to move forward in their faith and their walk with Christ. So that was sort of the genesis of this, is, just taking advantage of this sort of cycle that we're in to help us to think a little bit more about how we reflect on the past and maybe learn to do that in a productive way. Right.
And so I've been prepping for a sermon this week, and I think it's interesting in Hebrews 12:1. He says, therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses, I think there is an instance, or there is a way to look back rightly, and there's a way to look back wrongly.
Yeah, I agree.
And the focus of, I think, Paul in Corinthians and the writer of Hebrews is stop focusing on you when you look back.
Yeah.
And your shortcomings or your failings or how you feel like that thing stunk that was in the past. But instead look back and see God's faithfulness, see how God has worked, see what he is doing. And so I think it's just more of there's a perspective thing that has to change. So in Christian circles, you hear, especially if you have MyBridge or that's here, or Caleb's all over the place.
Yeah.
You hear about this 1 year Bible reading plan. And I think it's a good thing. So don't hear me say that it's not helpful and good, but what can happen for people is as you get on one of those plans and those plans are rigid and you read the Bible daily, and you should be anyway, but there's also there's a certain amount of things you have to read. And then if you don't read, you feel like you're behind. And that can be, like you were talking, paralyzing to people because, oh, I'm so far behind. And then we just give up.
Yeah.
And I think as we do that, we're looking at ourselves and our own failing and not coming through, reading through that plan like we're supposed to. And then you get 2 days behind, 3 days behind, and 4 days behind. And all of a sudden you're like, man, I just don't care about God. I'm just terrible. I'm just going to give up. Instead of like looking at that, okay, maybe you did fall behind, but if you keep at it, then all of a sudden it's like, okay, look at what God's shown you in that.
Yeah.
So you missed 4 or 5, 6 days or 10 days or whatever it is. If you look back and all you see is your failings and you're looking back to the wrong thing and you're ultimately concerned with yourself, and there's self-centeredness in looking back. So I think there's a perspective thing that needs to be shifted. And that's if we are looking for how God is working versus looking for how I've been failing, that's how we should look back. And then that then spurs us as we move forward to live in a better way as we keep our eyes and our focus on the gospel and on Christ instead of on myself.
Yeah.
So I think the biggest thing with this, as when we're looking back versus looking forward, and in general, I would agree, we should never be dwelling on the past.
That was the point. Dwelling on the past, living in the past.
So that came out, I think, in what you just said, and when you preach, is like you can't dwell on the past, but the past is very helpful if we look at it not to see our failings, but to see how God worked in spite of our failings. I think that's the key in looking back and being encouraged as we move forward versus being paralyzed.
Yeah. And so like in that sermon, I pointed out that there are legitimately good reasons to look back and to reflect back, but there's a distinction between reflecting in the past and dwelling in the past. So, I think there were 4 things that I said. Like one was you look back to see God's faithfulness, like you just said. You look back to see areas where you need to grow. So we need to be honest with ourselves about where we're falling short or where we need to grow or where God is convicting us that we need to be more faithful in, or whatever that might be. We also, I think a good reason to look back is as we see God's faithfulness in the midst of our failures, it fuels praise. So we can look back as a means of fueling worship and praise and adoration of God. But then the last one that I had was, when we dwell on the past, we rob ourselves of joy now. And really this comes, I think maybe fundamentally, as you were talking about, like focusing on ourselves, I think fundamentally maybe this comes down to an issue of identity. Because when we dwell in the past, we allow the past to define us. We allow our past failings to define us rather than what God says about us in Christ to define us. And so, yes, I've failed. And that's true. But that doesn't define me as a child of God. It doesn't define me as a Christian. It's just a reality of being a child of God and being a Christian. So even with our own kids, our kids fail. That failure does not define them. They get disciplined, corrected, admonished, encouraged, whatever the case might call for. But that failure is not thrown back in their face over and over again and become their identity. Their identity is still the fact that they're your child and they're loved. And they're accepted on the basis of being your child. And that same thing is true of us in our relationship with God. I think that's where the paralysis happens with a lot of people, because they subtly find their identity on their performance. And as they look back, they see failure in their performance, and they're looking back in a way that's looking to themselves, like you were saying. And so their acceptance before God is contingent upon their performance. And well, look at my performance. Look at all these bad things that I've done in the past. Even people that like have really, really, really messed up in the past Forgot to turn that off. And even before they came to Christ or after they've come to Christ, they've, whatever, they insert whatever, what we might call a serious sin right there. When we dwell in the past like that, we're denying the reality of Christ and the gospel and what he's done for us, because we're allowing that to define us rather than what God says about us to define us.
Yeah, because ultimately this just comes down to a focus issue, and our focus it shifts away from where it should be when we get into these little areas of they're not even little all the time. Sometimes you've got big areas of sin in your life or big areas of failure in your life, and the focus and dwelling is just on that and on myself. And like, I think it is identity, but ultimately it's a selfish perspective. It's a love of self and ability and like being self-reliant over focusing my eyes and then applying the gospel. So if I focus my eyes to the gospel and then I apply the gospel, then it's not about me anymore.
Yeah.
And it's about what Christ has done and what he's doing in me and the goal he has and the mission he has for me. And I'm just going to focus there. And as I fail, if my focus stays there, and that failing is obviously when my focus is removed. But if in that failing and that conviction, if I refocus back to him and I don't dwell on myself, then all of a sudden you aren't looking at the past.
Yeah.
And the only thing that you look back on the past for is to see God's faithfulness. And then like that actually spurs me to look back to Christ again.
Right.
Versus if I do this on my own and I'm trying to keep my righteousness and keep my standing before God, then all of a sudden I'm looking back to say, oh, I guess I'm a little better than I was then, but I messed up big time there again.
Right.
And for a lot of people that is really, really paralyzing. Or it doesn't even have to necessarily be a sin. It can be you lose something. So you lose a child or you lose a parent or you lose a job or you get demoted, whatever that is. If your focus is not on Christ, and then as that happens, we apply the gospel as we're focusing, because as we trust more, then there's repentance and there's this circuit that's completed of looking and applying, and then we do it again, and it just keeps happening again and again. We're such repetitive beings.
Yeah.
Whether we're Christ followers or not, like we fall into these repetitions. So we're going to do the same thing again and again. But if we can find ways, as we've heard the gospel, and keep our eyes there and not let distractions and maybe fleshly desires or outside voices pull our gaze away. And then, because what happens when we do that is it just goes right back to it's all about me.
Yeah.
If it's not all about Christ, then it's all about me. And you could say, well, there's people who aren't Christ followers who aren't self-centered. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, everything they do is going to have a self-centered motivation underneath it at its core.
Do you think that is like, I really think that one of the biggest spiritual warfare attacks that happen in Christians is this pulling at our natural inclination to be self-focused and self-centered.
I wonder if some of that is because we're in America too.
That could be. But I think this is something that we all struggle with. I mean, somebody wrongs you, and we don't have the attitude of Christ in a lot of cases. We have I'm entitled to this attitude. And I was just thinking about, like, if Satan or his agents can get us to take our focus off of Christ and put it on ourselves, the power of the gospel in our lives functionally is nullified in the way that we live, because we have no power to transform ourselves. And if we're looking at ourselves, we're taking our focus away from the hope that we have in the gospel and the source of our life and the source of our strength and all of the rest of that. And so I think for Christians in particular, if Satan can get us to take our eyes off of Christ and put it onto something or someone else, then he wins a battle, right? I don't think he doesn't win the war, but he wins a battle. And so the fight for a Christian, like the text that you're preaching this Sunday, is fixing our eyes upon Christ, the founder and perfecter of our faith. Like the fight of faith is a fight to focus on Christ and to trust Christ. I had some sort of leads into how should we think now? So if we don't dwell on the past, but the past can be helpful for reflection and in seeing some of those things, if we have the right focus.
Well, I was talking about that cycle. So when you come to faith, you focus, right? You see Christ, you hear the gospel, and there's either a rejection or an acceptance of that. And in that acceptance, there's a scene of Christ as valuable, as supremely valuable, as infinitely valuable. And so when you see something of such value, you focus on it and you keep your focus on it. Well, what happens in life as we are in this process of being made holy is we're looking and something distracts, right? And right. So we look away. And so as we look away, I think this text is really weird. I see this circuit in it. I think it presents it backwards because it's trying to emphasize that you need to keep your focus on Christ. But when we don't focus on Christ, I think, and we get in that sin, all of a sudden we can start to dwell on ourselves. And he says, look back, so that you would look back again to Christ. Yeah. And then you can remove these hindrances and these sins. So I think that's the circuit that's being made there. Is belief means seeing Christ as valuable. And as we live, we know we're going to struggle and our eyes are going to dip. And as they dip, God uses the past faithfulness, his faithfulness in the past, to remind us that he's trustworthy and that we need to continue to run the race well and remove the hindrances and the sins in our lives. And the way we do that is he refocuses us back to Christ and away from ourselves. So I think there's just a continual, it's just a process, and we go through that circuit again and again and again throughout our life. So I don't think that we talk about applying the gospel to ourselves all the time. We do. Yeah. And I think we at times try to figure out new ways to say something that's so simple to do. Yeah. Like it's not that it's easy to do, but it's simple to explain. Yeah. It's like, no, just stop. You stop looking at yourself. You listen to the conviction of the Spirit instead of ignoring it. I think that's where the hard part comes in. Yeah. Is conviction happens, and sometimes we'll confuse conviction for guilt. Yeah. And that leads into more conviction and more guilt, and that spirals out of control. Or we can take conviction, we can say thank you, and that conviction actually, it's like God it's his discipline, right? Which is what happens right after those 4 verses. You get right into discipline. He's putting his hand under your chin, and he's picking your face up, and he's getting your gaze back on him. Yeah. That's what he's doing. Yeah. And he does that through the things as you look at the past, and if you focus on me instead of yourself. I think that's what's happening here. It's just a continual thing that we get. I mean, we see this, like you were said, with our kids. We see things in our kids. We see this in our kids. How many times do we have to say the same thing again and again? And it's like a refocusing. And that's exactly what God's doing with us as we live out our life.
It was really funny that you said that, because you said it that way, like he lifts up our eyes to him, because one of the things that I'm adamant about with our kids is when I'm disciplining them, they have a tendency to look away from me. And it's
I think
shame.
That's kind of normal. I think that's normal for all of us.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And what I will stop my explanation and say, Ainsley, look at me. Look me in the eyes. I want you to look me in the eyes. And the reason for that is twofold. Number one, I want her to see my love for her in my eyes as I talk to her. But number two, I want her to have a attitude where when she fails, she looks to me and knows that I will accept her and be there for her in the midst of that failure. And so the way you said that, it was just sort of like something just kind of clicked. It's like, that's just sort of like a parable for our relationship with God. Like when we get stuck in this rut of looking in the past, dwelling in the past, we're taking our eyes off of God. And in effect, it's metaphorically looking down at the floor in shame, as opposed to looking at the object of our love, the object of our hope, the object of our affection. And so when we do that, then, I think there should be some responses now. So you look to the past, but then how should we think now? I think there's responses of thankfulness because we see God's faithfulness. We see his goodness in not holding our sin against us, but counting us righteous in Christ.
And that's where looking to the past to see God, when we don't want to look, is so helpful, because it's a reminder that I've sinned in the past, I've failed in the past, and God has never failed.
Exactly.
He's never rejected me. And even in that text, as you look back at Hebrews 11, there's a lot of people who did a lot of good things, but we know that Abraham sinned. We know that Jacob sinned. We know that Moses was afraid to do what he was told to do, and God got angry with him. We know those things, and yet they're in there, and God never failed to fulfill his promises to them. He never failed to walk through the trials with them. So we should be able to, and we, in the same way that we can look back at those fathers of the faith, that hall of faith. We can look back in our own lives and we can see how God has never failed, how he has always been walking with us, and that should spur us to look back to him.
Absolutely. And so like, there's also, I think there should be an attitude of contentment. So, you mentioned this before, but it's not always like sin. Sometimes it's situations or circumstances that happened in the past that have hurt or have been difficult to walk through. If we see God's faithfulness in the past and we see him as always being there and always satisfying and always meeting us in our need. I mean, even just in like 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, like, blessed be the God of all comfort who comforts us in our affliction so that we might be able to comfort others with the same comfort with which we have been comforted. God is a comforting God. God is a loving God. He is a there for you God. He is a never leave your side God. He is an always satisfying God. And when he's not satisfying, the problem is not him. The problem is us and where we're looking for our satisfaction. And so, like Paul says, like in Philippians, I've learned the secret to contentment. I know what it is to have much. I know what it is to have little. I know what it is to be full. I know what it is to be hungry. The secret to contentment is focusing on Christ. He says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can endure any situation with an attitude of contentment because God is the source of my strength. God is the source of my hope. God is the source of my joy. And so I think that should lead to, as we look back rightly, and maybe this is a good litmus test for whether or not we're looking back correctly or whether we're looking back wrongly and dwelling in the past. But does it produce thankfulness? Does it produce contentment? And then thirdly, does it produce trust? Because all of that stuff that we look back on should be a pool of God's faithfulness that we can look to in the moment when we are struggling to trust, that causes us to trust him more in that moment and trust him with whatever it is that we happen to be walking through. Trust him. Even the trust piece, even like when we see our failures in the past, seeing how he has never failed. And so my trust is not in my own ability. My trust is not in my own faithfulness. My trust is in God and his faithfulness and his promises that he's made that are credited to me by faith.
Yeah. Like, are those, I brought that out in my sermon because we can look at hindrances in the world and say, well, things that aren't hindrances are, because it's keeping me from, we'll say to ourselves, this is keeping me from looking to God, from running the race well, when it could be that that thing that you think is keeping you from running the race well is the race that God has set before you.
Right.
And so I think that just goes to, there's some things that we need to guard ourselves against. So at the core of what you're asking, when you look at that, is that just a selfishness?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a self-centeredness? And I think those are kind of can build off of thankfulness and contentment. If that was removed, would you be content?
Yeah.
Like when you really ask yourselves, because we all know that, okay, I've got maybe a crappy vehicle, and a lot of us say, if I just had a nicer vehicle, I'd be happy. And then we get that nicer vehicle, and then we're on to the next thing, and we're on to the next thing, and it just keeps going. We all intellectually know that. We've all probably intellectually and
experientially
had that experience, and we know that to be true. So, like the example I'm going to use in my sermon, which this will be after my sermon, is
this episode is just Joe's sermon in advance. If you can't make it on Sunday, listen to this podcast on Monday.
Parenthood, especially for a young, for most of us, moms stay at home. For a young mom, things change rapidly when we have kids, especially for moms. So they go from setting their own schedule, doing their own thing for the most part while we're at work. So whether they work or they're at home or whatever they're doing, meeting with friends, whatever it is, spending time with God is on their schedule, right? Well, when kids come along, you have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, all of a sudden their schedule changes.
Yeah.
There's a demand. And so I think we can be really tempted in the hard part of that to say, well, my kids are a hindrance to me running the race well. And that's just that. All that is we need a perspective change to know that's the race that God set before you.
Yeah.
And now your priorities have to change and things have to shift. So we have to be looking at the things in the world and be asking God for wisdom to, hey, God, show me what is actually a hindrance versus what is the race that you're setting before me. Like it would be very easy to look at a death or a sickness or a cancer or a lost job or failing a grade as a hindrance versus this is part of the race. So we like having the right focus and the right perspective. And the way that we do that is by not looking at ourselves, because as soon as we start dwelling on ourselves and we start thinking about all the things that we want and we value, that's when it's really hard to see those things that God has put in your path as hindrances versus gifts.
Yeah.
So,
and then that leads to, so Paul says, forgetting what lies behind, I press forward toward the goal to the upward call of Christ. In your text, it says,
it's my text.
Yeah, in your text, this Sunday, or last Sunday when you listen to this, it's looking to Christ, the founder and perfecter of our faith. So, have you seen What About Bob?
I've seen
the old Bill Murray
show
from like the 80s or something like that, right? Bob is like this neurotic, hopeless case that meets with Richard Dreyfuss, who's a psychologist, and all sorts of shenanigans ensue. But one of the things that, like, he's paralyzed by fear.
Yeah.
And, he can't walk out in the hallway without help. Like, I mean, just that bad. And one of the things that Dreyfuss says to him is just baby steps. So Bob is like walking, he's like baby steps out the door, baby steps onto the elevator, baby steps down the stairs. Like, he's saying this as he's going along. And so I think that's sort of like a parallel for us in our Christian life in looking forward and pressing forward. God is not in a hurry to change us to be like Christ. He does it incrementally and over time, and he's faithful to do it. Ultimately, it's realized when we die and get new bodies. But for some people, it can just be so overwhelming that it's just like, take baby steps. Like, what is one thing that God is calling me to do to focus on Christ today? Maybe it's not read through the Bible in a year. Maybe it's not, have 10 minutes of devotions every day. Maybe it's just simply like reading a text in the morning, first thing when you wake up, or, whatever that might be for you. I don't even want to like qualify it, but like, what's the baby step that you take to refocus and to press forward versus living and dwelling in the past? Sometimes it's just, we just overwhelm ourselves because we think we have to do everything right now. And in reality, we just need to take those steps of faithfulness, those steps of obedience that God's calling us to take. And he's not calling us to take them all at once.
Don't you think that it starts simply with a daily surrender of my own ability to do things?
Yes.
Like there's got to be, it doesn't have to be, but it starts with a willingness to just, as you start, God, I can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
I can do it through you and you can be working in me, but I can't stay on this regimen of whatever it is like I'm supposed to without your help.
Mm-hmm.
So help me to do it. I think we've got to take the advice of Paul and the writer of Hebrews and just listen to our God and stop trying to do things on our own.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's like, oh, so everyone shakes their head. Yep. Intellectually. Yep. That's right. And yet practically, we don't do that. We're told and we're bombarded in our culture. You can do it. You can do anything you want. You can be anything you want. All you have to do is really, really work at it.
If you believe it, you can achieve it, baby.
So this whole thing, and it's not that there's not hard work involved, but it's the grace of God working through us to work hard. So we have to start with that. I'm going to be your servant. I'm going to surrender, and I'm going to simply do what you have called me to do today.
Right.
And if that conviction is not necessarily I know we're pounding on this 1 year Bible reading app. I think it's because of pet peeve of both of ours. But if it's not that, then don't start there. Maybe it's open your Bible and read today. And maybe the next day it's like share something that you've seen with somebody. And maybe you're not in it that day, but are you surrendering daily to the grace of God and letting that move you to act versus trying to act on your own so that the grace of God stays with you? Well, that perspective has to be, you've got to get that right and just, no, it's not about me. And my job is to believe. My job is to trust. My job is to have faith. God has done the work and will continue to do the work in me.
And that's where that baby step thing, like the baby step thing might be in that moment of frustration where you're feeling down about past failure. The baby step is not pick yourself up by your bootstraps, be a better person. The baby step is not, well, man, there's this overwhelming amount of growth I need to have in my life. I better start working on it. The baby step is refocusing on the gospel, refocusing on Christ, reminding yourself of the gospel, preaching the gospel to yourself. I think that we affirm that, but we functionally deny its power in our lives because our preaching the gospel to ourselves is just a recitation of a memorized, or can be just a recitation of a memorized mantra where it's like, all right, I'm a sinner, I'm separated from God. Jesus came to save sinners. He died on the cross for my sin. If I've repented and trusted in Jesus Christ, therefore I have eternal life because Jesus rose from the dead and he's coming back to get me. All right, I've done that. Now on to the real stuff. Now on to the real work where I grind. And I'm not saying that there's not grind, but that the way that Paul says is I worked harder than anybody else, but it wasn't I, but the grace of God at work within me. The grace of God cannot be at work within us if preaching the gospel to ourselves is just the initial box that we check before we move on to the important stuff that we really contribute to. It's resting in that. It's preaching it to our souls in a way that causes us to stop and to believe and to trust and to rest and to treasure God more. And until that happens, like we haven't really grasped the power and the scandal of the gospel, because really the gospel calls us to lay down all of our efforts and trust God. And then all of our efforts that come out of the gospel are a result of his empowering grace and his work in our lives, not our own grit.
the application of the gospel is the affections being stirred as we look to what Christ has accomplished, what God has done in sacrificing himself in our place. And out of those affections and that valuing, then come the action, then comes the work, then comes the grinding. But all of that effort and all of that work is done in response, not
to initiate
prior to looking.
We don't work.
I don't have to look. I don't have to work and work and work so that I'm able to look.
Yeah.
If I do that, then all I'm going to do is continue to focus on myself and actually continue to drop my eyes. I have to look. And then from that looking and from what we know and it having a real effect on the heart, that application turns into the action.
I don't work to get God's grace. I work as a result of God's grace.
God's grace empowers me to work.
Exactly. But I think that if we take this conversation as a whole, I think you can start to see how this actually empowers and enables forward movement, because I actually can change. I actually can grow. My relationship with Christ can be better tomorrow than it was yesterday or last week or last year. But it's counterintuitive. It's not because of what I do. It's because of what God has done for me and living in light of that. So it actually produces hope for the future. So when Paul says, forgetting what lies behind, I press forward toward the goal, to the upward call of Christ, what he's saying is that there's greater things forward than there are behind. And when we get into that cycle that we were talking about earlier, we can get into a rut of thinking, man, the best days are behind me. The best things are behind me. And man, remember when whatever the golden years, whatever it was, whatever that golden age, that golden era in your life was, whether it was just a season of incredible joy and contentment in your marriage, or a season of tremendous blessing in the church that you're a part of, or a season when things went the way that you wanted them to go, and now they're not. We can, if we're dwelling in the past, we can be like measuring everything against that. But when we take this attitude, we can actually anticipate greater blessings in the future, if not in this life, in the world to come. So you might not ever have, and it kind of comes back to that. You might not have the season of joy in your home life that you had before in the same way that you had it, because maybe your spouse has passed away. But that doesn't mean that you won't have joy. It means that God just provides joy in different avenues. And he's never going to just abandon you. All of those joys in this life are aimed to point us to our joy in Christ. And so just because you had a really blessed season or a blessed time period in your life where it was just a season of incredible joy and contentment in your life, your joy and contentment, if it terminates on that situation, is terminating in the wrong place. And if it's pointing back to Christ, then you always have something to look forward to.
Christ, I think, is trying to get us to see with an eternal perspective versus a temporary one. Like that analogy of the race. Well, you don't look at the sides, or you don't look at them, but you're focused on the goal. And same thing in the text. Well, what's the goal? The goal is to finish well, right?
Yeah.
Finish the race well. The goal is to get to the end. And what's at the end? And that's where that focusing on the gospel and focusing on Christ really matters, because all those things, those heartaches and pains and things that are hard, they're temporary.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what God is trying to get us to see. It's like, these things might be hard, but I'm working them together for your good. You're growing in perseverance. I'm growing your faith. This is part of the race I've set before you. Keep your eyes on me. There's joy, and my faithfulness is going to surround you. Keep coming. Finish this race well.
I think in that sermon, I said your life might not get better in this life.
Yeah.
Like, as far as like your situation might not improve. It might actually get worse. Does that mean you don't have something to look forward to? Because ultimately our hope is not in this world. Our hope is in the joy that we have with Christ face to face for eternity. So I think that also causes us to pursue deeper fellowship with him now and to anticipate and look forward to his ongoing blessings, because he doesn't abandon us. He doesn't leave us. And his favor upon us is not contingent upon our performance. It's rooted solely in Christ and his faithfulness. So, yeah. Any other thoughts?
I would just say, look back to see his faithfulness and look forward to run the race. So if you tend to be one that dwells on things that have happened in the past, hopefully you're dwelling and looking for how God's been faithful, because that's the only way that we should be looking at the past and see. I mean, yes, there's things that we can learn from, but in learning from those things, we can see how God has changed us.
Mm-hmm.
We can see how he's grown us. Even if you just look back at my own life, a year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and who I was then versus who I am now. It doesn't take looking very long to see how faithful God is and how he's been working. And we get in the muck of life and in the midst of trials or joys, and we can completely forget about that. So look back to be encouraged.
Yeah.
Don't look back to find failures and be guilty.
Or don't look back to find your joy. Like that's nostalgia is a cruel mistress, because nostalgia is remembering times of joy in the past, times of contentment in the past, at the expense of where God is working now or where he will work in the future. So be careful, be cautious with nostalgia. Living in the past in that way too. The best days are not always behind us. The best days are never behind us in an eternal perspective, which is what we should have. So anything else?
Nope. I'm out of words.
I'm out of words too.
So we've had some questions on our discussion on communion we had on an episode a long time ago. I'm gonna have to revisit that.
Yeah. So we got those emails. We've been obviously not recording for a while, but we're gonna get to those here in the next couple of weeks. And if you guys have other suggestions or ideas or things that you'd like to hear addressed, then send us a message, pastordiscussions@gmail.com, where you can find out how to get in touch with us on the website. And we will be back next week. We should be. Lord willing.
All right, so tune in then for the next discussion on the Pastor Discussions podcast, your weekly conversation on doctrine, faith, and the Christian life.